If you would open your Bibles to Numbers chapter 28. Numbers chapter 28. That's where we're going to pick up this morning. And Numbers chapters 28 and 29 really kind of go together. They're what I would call a sacrificial calendar of sorts. And the basic point of these two chapters is to explain what sacrifices get offered on what days. And so, well, we'll start off taking this a couple sections at a time. I don't think we're going to read all of this because it starts to become very repetitive. And when you consider the fact that when I taught Leviticus, I read almost everything in the book, and I'm saying that this is repetitive, you know what I'm talking about. Numbers chapter 28. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Command the sons of Israel, and say to them, You shall be careful to present my offering, my food for my offerings by fire, of a soothing aroma to me at their appointed time. You shall say to them, This is the offering by fire which you shall offer to the Lord. 2 male lambs, 1 year old, without defect, as a continual burnt offering every day. You shall offer the one lamb in the morning, and the other lamb you shall offer at twilight. Also 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour for a grain offering, mixed with 1/4 of a hin of beaten oil. It is a continual burnt offering which was ordained in Mount Sinai as a soothing aroma, an offering by fire to the Lord. Then the drink offering with it shall be 1/4 of a hin for each lamb. In the holy place you shall pour out a drink offering of strong drink to the Lord. The other lamb you shall offer at twilight as the grain offering of the morning, and as its drink offering you shall offer it, an offering by fire, a soothing aroma to the Lord." All right, now what we're talking about here is the daily sacrifice. And in a nutshell, what would you say that consists of mainly? I'll write these up on the board so we can keep track of them as we go. This is the daily sacrifice is... How many? 2. 2 burnt offerings, and I'm just saying 2 lambs.
What they were.
Yeah, 1 in the morning, 1 in the evening. And this is every day in Israel. And plus, we have the grain and the drink offering, which I'm just going to put GD because I don't feel like writing all this stuff out. But yeah, we have the daily offering was 2 lambs plus their accompanying grain and drink offerings. And you know, if anybody has forgotten what proportions of grain and drink are to be offered, you can always go back to Numbers chapter 15 and read all of that in detail, and it will tell you. But that's the basic daily offering that was always to be offered as long as the tabernacle or the temple was standing. Now, let me ask you a question. We read earlier in the law that the Sabbath day was to be kept holy, to be honored before all the people. You weren't supposed to work on the Sabbath day. Does that apply to the priests as well?
Priestly duties.
Why is it I was thinking of the same thing you were? Jesus said the priests violate the Sabbath and they are not condemned for it.
Exactly. In Matthew chapter 12 in verse 5, have you not read in the law that the priests break the Sabbath and are innocent? And in fact, the reason for this is in verses 9 and 10. On the Sabbath day, 2 male lambs, 1 year old, without defect, 2/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with an oil as a grain offering and its drink offering. This is the burnt offering of every Sabbath in addition to the continual burnt offering and its drink offering. So, on the Sabbath, and on the Sabbath, what are we offering? Extra. Basically double, right? The 2 lambs in addition to that, so really we're looking at 4 lambs plus the grain and drink offering. Right, exactly. So the Sabbath, the priests are actually pulling double duty. Everybody else is not working on the Sabbath, but they are working twice as much on the Sabbath. They break the Sabbath and are innocent, as Jesus puts it. And so in essence, this is one of those situations where, whenever a perceived conflict is going to exist between 2 laws, God steps in and says, this is how you resolve it. This is what I want you to do, basically. Verses 11 through 15, at the beginning of each of your months, you shall present a burnt offering to the Lord, 2 bulls, 1 ram, 7 male lambs, 1 year old without defect, 3/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with oil for a grain offering for each bull, 2/10 of fine flour mixed with oil for a grain offering for the 1 ram, and 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with oil for a grain offering for each lamb, for a burnt offering of a soothing aroma, an offering by fire to the Lord. Their drink offerings shall be 1/2 a hin of wine for a bull, and 1/3 of a hin for the ram, and 1/4 of a hin for a lamb. This is the burnt offering of each month throughout the months of the year, and 1 male goat for a sin offering to the Lord. It shall be offered with its drink offering in addition to the continual burnt offering. So this was the monthly offering, and it was actually offered at the new moon. I'm going to write that up here. The Jewish calendar was lunar. Every month was exactly the same. It was 30 days. They didn't do any of this 30 days half September business that we do. Every month was exactly the same length, and it always began at the new moon festival. And at the new moon festival, what did they offer? It's a much longer list.
1 ram.
2 bulls. Okay, so 2 bulls. 1 ram,
7 lambs.
7 lambs.
3 pigeons.
Yeah, you left out the goat.
Oh.
1 goat. And
Let's see the goat.
the goat?
Big goat.
Their goat?
Yeah. It's for a sin offering.
Yeah, in verse 15, 1 male goat for a sin offering to the Lord. It shall be offered with its drink offering in addition to the continual burnt offering. So the bulls, the rams, and the lambs are all burnt offerings. They're offered wholly on the altar, and the goat is the sin offering. So that's basically what you're looking at, plus the daily sacrifice. So really it's 9 lambs, and we're looking at 13 sacrifices total. That was the New Moon Festival. It's not referred to as the New Moon Festival here, but it's referred to everywhere else in the Bible as that. You see that referred to in 1 Samuel 20. David and Saul are eating at the... Well, David doesn't show up, but Saul is holding this New Moon Festival, and David doesn't show up, and Jonathan tells him, you will be missed because your seat will be empty. Also, Isaiah, Amos, they all talked about the New Moon Festival. Paul refers to it in Colossians chapter 2 when he says that no one is to act as your judge in regard to festival or new moon or Sabbath day. The new moon, this is the specific thing he's referring to when he makes mention of that. Alright, that's beginning of the month. Now, at this point, from verses 16 to 25, we have the Passover offerings. And I'll just save you a lot of work and tell you that they're exactly the same as the new moon offerings. Every day, exactly the same. The only difference is that you're offering this every day of the Passover. And at the end of it, you have a holy convocation. At the beginning and the end of it, in verses 18 and in verse 25, you have a holy convocation. So I'm just going to go ahead and write Passover here as well. Also referred to as the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And then, from verses 26 to 31, we have the Feast of Weeks. Anybody know the other name we have for the Feast of Weeks? No, it's not Hanukkah. Hanukkah is the Feast of Dedication, which is not mentioned in the law, actually. Feast of Weeks was only 1 day. It was a week of weeks after Passover, 7 weeks plus 1 day. Pentecost, yes, very good. So the Feast of Pentecost, and I'll save you some trouble again and tell you that the sacrifices on Pentecost were exactly the same as the sacrifices on the new moon and the Passover. So that basically settles it. Now, in Leviticus 23, we learn that sometimes peace offerings were also given on Pentecost. Those are not mentioned in this chapter, And the reason why is because this chapter is dealing specifically with burnt offerings and sin offerings. It does not deal with peace offerings. Those were something else altogether. And in verses 39 and 40 of the next chapter, there's an explanatory comment about that. So, any questions so far? All right, now, yes, Mark.
I just have one comment to make, and this always causes some controversy. Because there are folks who disagree with me. But when, good grief.
And you can't remember
Cain
it.
and Abel brought their offerings. The problem with Cain's offering was not that it was an offering of the fruit of the ground, because God required grain offerings and offerings of the fruit of the ground of the Israelites.
Yes.
Most people tend to focus in on, well, Abel brought of the animal sacrifice, which is what God wanted. He didn't want the offering of the fruit of the ground. And I really don't think that that's what it was. It was their attitude when they brought it. Now, either way you look at it, it was their attitude when they brought it. Abel did what God wanted, what he knew God wanted, and Cain did what Cain wanted to do.
Yes.
And that's the bottom line.
No, I actually agree with that. I think that the primary problem we see in Genesis 4 is that the quality of Cain's offering more than it is the substance, the actual thing that's being offered. I'm not going to get into a long tangent about why I think that, but we talked about that when we covered Genesis and you weren't here, but yeah, I basically agree with you. Now, all right, chapter 29, the Feast of Trumpets, verses 1 through 6. In the 7th month, on the first day of the month, you shall have a holy convocation. You shall do no laborious work. It will be to you a day for the blowing of trumpets. You shall offer a burnt offering as a soothing aroma to the Lord. 1 bull, 1 ram, 7 male lambs, 1 year old without defect, and their grain offering, fine flour mixed with oil, 3/10 of an ephah for the bull, 2/10 for the ram, and 1/10 for each of the 7 lambs. Offer 1 male goat for sin offering, to make atonement for you, besides the burnt offering of the new moon and its grain offering, and the continual burnt offering and its grain offering, and their drink offerings according to the ordinance, for soothing aroma and offering by fire to the Lord. Now, this is a reference to the Feast of Trumpets, which took place on the first day of the 7th month. So I'm going to write trumpets here. All right, now on the Feast of Trumpets, what did they offer? What does this list remind us of? Once again.
Well, one thing, they offered some sound, the blowing of the trumpets.
Well, yes, that's right. They had the blowing of the trumpets. Numbers chapter 10 talks more specifically in detail about these particular trumpets. What about the sacrifices?
Bull, a ram, 7 male lambs, grain offering.
It's almost, and plus the goat for the sin offering, it's almost the same as the new moon, right? But okay, the new moon's the first of every month. Feast of Trumpets is the first of the 7th month, and they say, you're offering this on top of the new moon sacrifices. So basically, what you're looking at total is 3 bulls, 2 rams, 14 lambs, and 2 goats. And the 2 lambs for the daily offering. They were awfully busy, yes. The grand total of 22 sacrifices on the Feast of Trumpets. And keep in mind, all of these numbers are assuming that the first of the month and the Feast of the Trumpets do not fall on the Sabbath, in which case we've got to throw another 2 lambs on the fire as well.
God did not intend for the priest to have an easy job. He intended for them to do what He intended for them to represent the people to Him, and that was work.
Right.
That's a lesson for all this.
Yes. Don, you have something.
I don't remember if we studied this or not, but who is it that brought animals for the sacrifice?
Well, typically the worshiper would bring an animal for his own sacrifice to make atonement. In this particular case, I think what we have here is and the Bible doesn't really specify who is actually bringing these offerings. It's basically... Well, it seems more likely that this was... What we're putting up here is the bare minimum. Let me put it that way. This is what's needed to keep the temple tabernacle going. So I imagine the heads of the families would do this. Do we have a reference for that? Or?
Sacrifices. It was in
Because I can't think of a reference offhand as to who would be doing this, but it just kind of says, basically this commandment's offered to the sons of Israel. How you worked it out, I imagine... I know in Numbers chapter 7 they had a series of dedicatory offerings that the heads of the tribes brought before God, but that's not exactly the same thing as we see here. I'm sorry? Well, yes, everybody would have to have an awful lot of livestock. I think one thing that needs to be kept in mind here is, it's not like today, where you can pop over to McDonald's and get a cheeseburger or whatnot. Eating meat was considered a luxury to them. That was something reserved for special occasions because it's not something you can do very often. Most of the time they had to sustain themselves on bread. And meat was a big deal. It was something for the feasts. So sacrificing animals is a bigger deal to them even than we would think it would be to us. Don, do you have something? You look like you had something.
I was looking at chapter 15. Verse 4, the one who presents his offering shall present to the Lord a grain offering, 1/10 of fine flour mixed with 1/4 pint of oil. Prior to that, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the sons of Israel, and say to them, if you enter the land live, which I am giving you, then make an offering by fire to the Lord, a burnt offering for a sacrifice to fulfill a special vow, whereas a freewill offering for your crimes to make a suitable aroma to the Lord from the herd or from and then he talks about the one who's going to do it.
Right.
I don't know, it's just a question because I don't know how they worked it out as to who was going to provide this stuff, or maybe it was your turn, your turn, your turn.
I do think that Numbers...
They haven't specified yet. I don't think we've studied it.
Well, I do think that Numbers chapter 15, particularly the first 16 verses, the principle of that chapter appears to be that anytime you offer sacrifice at all, this is the grain and this is the drink offering that goes with it. And it depends solely on what the animal is. And he actually goes on in verses 13 through 16 to say that this law applies to both natives and foreigners. In other words, it's not saying, you all need to come make sacrifices and this is what they are. It's saying anytime you make a sacrifice, this is what you offer with it. Now Numbers 28 is a little different. It's saying that on such and such a day, you need to offer these sacrifices. And it doesn't really single out who's supposed to do it. It just says, it talks generally addressing the sons of Israel. Speak to the sons of Israel saying this. I don't know where they got it. Heath is probably right when he says that they were the tribal heads.
Well, it says in chapter 19, speak unto the children of Israel, have them bring the description of the things that they need to bring, present to the priests, and so forth, and so on and so forth. The heads of the families represented the families that needed
Speak to the sons of Israel. Well, I mean, and we see a clear instance of that in Numbers 7, like I said before. The heads of the families sort of presenting offerings on behalf of the tribes. And that may be what's going on here in 28 and 29. I honestly don't know, though. Mark.
Well, there are commandments throughout the Old Testament that are given. And I mean, even in the patriarchal age, there are commandments given where God says, this is what you do, and He doesn't give them any more instruction than that. He leaves it up to men of faith to figure out how to do it the best way. And I think this may be one of those cases. I cannot recall anything that I was kind of thinking that maybe these offerings were taken out of the tithing that was done, that was given to the Levites every year, and that they would take the best of what they had been tithed, because they got the best of what the children of Israel had to offer.
That's possible.
And maybe they took the best of that. I don't, I'm at a loss on that.
And this is one of those questions that I do think at some point we do have to admit, well, I don't know. It's one of these things. They worked it out somehow. We know that.
God does give commands even today that He lets us work out the details.
Yeah.
You can also conclude that there had to have been men during that time that raised these animals. They knew they needed them for these.
Raising animals specifically for sacrifice? Oh, possible. Yeah. We could. That's true. I mean, you might be right about that. I don't know for certain. I'm basically saying that. Don.
That's all speculation.
Yeah.
Kind of like Noah. I mean, God told him to build it out of gopher wood, but he didn't
What's gopher wood?
he didn't tell him whether he had to, go get himself a nice skill saw from Lowe's, or get a handsaw, or how.
Some of it's just, yeah.
He left it up to him how to work out how to get it to those dimensions and the wood. I mean, he did specify certain things, and those are things that he had to adhere to. The building of it was left up to him.
Yeah.
And obviously, I guess, how these guys presented these particular animals at these particular times for God's people, I guess, was left up to them.
Right.
But I know that given human nature, that I know that had to be, in my mind, that had to be distributed fairly evenly amongst the tribes.
Seems like that would be fair.
Otherwise, you'd probably have some that would go, hey, I gave more than you guys. I mean, that's just human nature. So
Well-
that's why I was trying to,
Right.
is there something in there I missed?
No, well, if there is, I've missed it too. All I know is that, God said, on these days, these animals need to be on the altar. And,
There's a necessary inference that follows
from
from the facts that they presented.
we got to figure out how to do it. Work it out somehow, but make sure these animals are on the altar on these days. The Day of Atonement, verses 7 through 11. It doesn't... basically, it says here, on the 10th day of the 7th month, that's the Day of Atonement, you shall have a holy convocation. You shall humble yourselves. You shall not do any work. You shall present a burnt offering to the Lord as a soothing aroma, 1 bull, 1 ram, 7 male lambs, 1 year old, having them without defect, and their grain offering, fine flour mixed with oil, 3/10 of an ephah for the bull, 2/10 for the 1 ram, 1/10 for each of the 7 lambs, 1 male goat for sin offering, besides the sin offering of atonement, and the continual burnt offering and its grain offering and their drink offerings. So on the Day of Atonement, basically what we got is the same thing that was going on with the Feast of Trumpets. 1 bull, 1 ram, 7 lambs, 1 goat. And each was accompanied by their grain and drink offerings. And this was in addition to the daily sacrifice, and this was in addition to the atonement sacrifice that we read about in Leviticus chapter 16, where they had the 2 goats, and 1 goat would be killed, and its blood sprinkled on the mercy seat. The other goat would have the sins of Israel placed upon it and be released into the wilderness. Sometimes we call that the scapegoat. And so that's what goes on the Day of Atonement. Mark.
What's a convocation?
A convocation is basically, it's an assembly, is what it is. It's a...
Mine said assembly, reading, or summoning.
Yeah. Basically, a convocation is a time...
Or something would happen there.
And a convocation is basically just an assembly. People gather together for this holy assembly, and everybody in Israel is expected to be there. No one's allowed to show up empty-handed because they're all expected to give something. And, I mean, you saw that at the Passover, and you're going to see that again when we talk about the Feast of Booths, the Feast of Tabernacles. So all in all, what we've got here is basic. Also, we have the expression, you shall humble yourselves, which was a Hebrew idiom for fasting. We see that pop up several times in Scripture as well. The only fast commanded in the law was the fast on the Day of Atonement. All right. Now, verses 12 through 38 are the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Tabernacles. And this is where it gets interesting. For the first and the last days, we have a holy convocation. Nobody's allowed to work. And I'm not going to read this because it gets really long and repetitive. But for 7 days, they were supposed to offer 14 lambs a day for burnt offerings, 2 rams every day for burnt offerings, 1 goat every day for sin offering, and then 13 bulls on the first day, 12 bulls on the second day, 11 bulls on the third day, etc. Keep decreasing a bull until you get to the end, down to the last day where you have 7 bulls. So, if you can follow that logic, that's what they were doing. They offered 13 bulls, and they kept subtracting 1 for each successive day. And on the 8th day, the numbers were just reduced to 1 bull, 1 ram, 7 lambs, and 1 goat. And if you do all the math and you add it all up with all the and everything, including the daily sacrifices, you come up with 215 sacrifices for the whole week. So, they had a very busy week on the Feast of Booths. This was the greatest volume of sacrifices that was offered in Israel during the year. Feast of Booths came to be after the Feast of Booths was not really kept much throughout the Old Testament history, but after the return from captivity, it came to be one of the most important feasts for the Jews. So much so that Jesus used it as the basis for a couple of his statements. I am the fountain of living water, I am the light of the world, in John chapter 7 and 8. All of that takes place during the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Tabernacles. And so they would have been offering these sacrifices throughout that festival. Any comments or questions on that?
Doesn't make sense from human logic that if we're killing and burning up all of these animals and all of this food, that it's going to make us any wealthier, does it?
No, it doesn't.
But God said, if you will keep all of these things and you will give me my due, I will open the doors of heaven and pour out on you a blessing that's so great you can't receive it. And then notice they didn't keep a lot of these holy assemblies that God commanded them to, and they were never prospered for it.
Right.
You know, these events seem to carry with it an element of celebration. I mean,
That's true.
you know, when we come together to eat as a group, it's a good time. It's enjoyable. And again, it says to us, God gives us commands to perform, and along with that, He gives us instructions on how it's to be done. We can't do it according to our own fancy. We got to do it exactly as He commanded us to do it. He's very specific about it, very detailed, and He keeps His people busy. That's a tremendous blessing.
I really want to say something about the New Testament application of all of this. This is a sacrificial calendar, and it's very, very concerned with the keeping of days and months and seasons. The New Testament has a few things to say about that. In Galatians chapter 4, Paul, in verses 1 through 11, Paul makes this argument. I say, as long as the heir is a child, he does not differ at all from a slave, although he is the owner of everything. But he is under guardians and managers until the date set by the father. So also we, while we were children, were held in bondage under the elemental things of the world. But when the fullness of the time came, God sent forth His Son, born of a woman, born under the law, so that He might redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. Because you are the sons, God has sent forth the Spirit of His Son into our hearts, saying, Abba, Father. Therefore you are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, then an heir through God. However, at that time, when you did not know God, you were slaves to those which by nature are no gods. But now that you have come to know God, or rather to be known by God, how is it that you turn back again to the weak and worthless elemental things to which you desire to be enslaved all over again? You observe days and months and seasons and years. I fear for you that perhaps I've labored over you in vain. Now there's a couple of things. We could talk about this passage literally all day because it's pretty deep. But the one point I want to take away from this is this double meaning of the elemental things, which the pagans interpreted. They were enslaved to interpreting the stars, the pagan signs, the constellations. But there's a sense in which those under the law of Moses were also enslaved to the elemental things, because they observed days, months, seasons, years, things that were determined by the rotation of the earth, the sun, the moon, and so on. This is the elemental things right here. Now once you are in Christ, he says you don't want to be enslaved to the elemental things anymore. But nevertheless, here you are, submitting to the law, submitting to circumcision, submitting to all these things, and he says you're going to become enslaved to these things. And it's not like observing special days is wrong in and of itself. The problem is when you start saying, well, this is somehow necessary in addition to what Christ has already done and our trust in Christ. And again, in Colossians chapter 2, Paul makes a similar point. In Colossians chapter 2 and verses 16 through 23, he says, no one is to act as your judge in regard to food or drink, the Old Testament food laws, or in respect to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath day, things which are a mere shadow of what is to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. So these things are ultimately shadows that point to the true substance, Christ. Verse 18, let no one keep defrauding you of your prize by delighting in self-abasement and the worship of angels, taking his stand on visions he has seen, inflated without cause by his fleshly mind, and not holding fast to the head, from whom the entire body, being supplied and held together by the joints and ligaments, grows with a growth which is from God. If you have died with Christ to the elementary principles of the world, why, as if you were living in the world, do you submit yourself to decrees such as do not handle, do not taste, do not touch, which all refer to things destined to perish with use in accordance with the commandments and teachings of men? These are matters which have, to be sure, the appearance of wisdom and self-made religion and self-abasement and severe treatment of the body, but are of no value against fleshly indulgence. And one more passage in Romans chapter 14 in verses 5 through 9. Paul makes this comment, and the primary issue here is the eating of meat, but Paul brings up the keeping of special days as well. He says one person regards one day above another regards every day alike. Each person must be fully convinced in his own mind. He who observes the day, observes it for the Lord. He who eats does so for the Lord, for he gives thanks to God. He who eats not, for the Lord he does not eat, and gives thanks to God. For not one of us lives for himself, and not one dies for himself. For if we live for the Lord. Or if we die for the Lord. Therefore, whether we live or die, we are the Lord's. For to this end Christ died and lived again, that he might be the Lord both of the dead and of the living. Now let me ask you something. Would it be wrong to observe a Jewish feast? Would it be wrong to observe these special days? No, there would be nothing wrong with that. In fact, there were a number of Christians that continued to do this. Is it wrong to observe any holiday whatsoever? Let me ask you that.
Perhaps.
No.
Okay, I'm going to say perhaps.
Well, people who criticize...
How you're observing it, why you're observing it.
Yeah, that's true.
Individual situation.
Let me ask you this. Okay, well, I mean, in general, there's nothing wrong with, setting aside a special day to think about. And to the religious people, holidays or holy days, there's no such thing as a secular holiday. They're all holy days. They're all religious holidays to these people, including the ones that they added, like Purim or Hanukkah or other things like that. And there's nothing wrong with setting aside those days personally for yourself, to reflect on spiritual matters. That's a good thing to do. But what happens if I come in here and start telling you all that, I have now declared this day to be a holiday and all of you must observe it? Anything wrong with that? Yeah. Oh, yes, there is something wrong with that. And Paul clearly leaves that in the realm of individual conscience and decision here. You cannot bind that on others. You cannot force people to submit to those decrees. You cannot act as somebody's judge in regard to into the new moon or Sabbath day or festival or whatever it is. You can observe it yourself, but you cannot force other people to do the same, because the true substance belongs to Christ. And truly, every day actually belongs to the Lord to begin with. There's a whole separate issue of people who celebrate, people who say it's wrong to celebrate holidays with pagan origins, which my question for them is, okay, well, what day is today? What day is today? Our church meets on Thursday. Oh, so you recognize Thor. Is that it? Because that's what Thursday's named after. All the days of the week are named after pagan gods. And so you're
being the sun.
Yeah, I know. We meet on Sunday. That's why it's named that. If you think that, if you think association with pagan origins makes it wrong to recognize a particular holiday, then you have to stop recognizing the days of the week. Because all the names of the days of the week come from pagan gods. All right? Yeah. Yes, Mark.
The point of all of this was not to establish that righteousness involves this. Mm-hmm. This is not righteousness. To the truly thinking, spiritually minded Jewish person, he would realize that you could offer up all the lambs and bulls and grain and drink and everything in the world, and it would not equal the damage you've done by one sin that you've committed in your life. When you look at, after Cain killed Abel, what happened to Cain? He was put out from the presence of God. He was utterly separated. More so than Adam and Eve were when they were separated out of the Garden of Eden. And a mark was placed on his forehead that showed that he was separated from God. We go down through history time and time again. When the earth became so sinful that there were only 8 righteous souls left on the earth, that was Noah and his family, God destroyed the world to save Noah and his family from the sin of the earth. Mm-hmm. Peter makes that very plain. the consequence, or the ultimate consequences of sin was death. Absolute separation from God. And nothing that you could do would ever make up for a single sin that you committed. And all of this couldn't do it. And Moses was not establishing this to the children of Israel to show them that, oh, well, you do these things and you atone for your sin and all of this. The whole idea in all of this that we read is God makes the atonement. You do these things, but God's the one making the atonement. So this was all about grace. Now, the Jews, over time, by Jesus' day, got bound up in all of these things and got to thinking that this was righteousness. They forgot why the law was given. And there were all kinds, it wasn't spelled out in the law, this is why the law is given, as a schoolmaster to bring you to Christ. That was never spelled out in that way in the written portion of the law. But the idea was always there. You can see it throughout the old law. That this was not true righteousness, this was the thing that led you to the grace of God, which gave a man true righteousness. Not of his own merit. Now, Jesus comes in at the end and says, if all of this stuff couldn't save you, you can't save yourself. And when we preach baptism for remission of sins, obviously, if this can't save you, being dipped in a little bit of water there can't save you. It's God's grace.
It's not the removal of dirt from flesh, but the appeal to God for a good conscience. That is the way in which immersion saves you, yes. And I guess we're going to end on that note, because we're out of time. We did not get in chapter 30, but I didn't expect all the sacrificial calendar to prompt so much discussion. I guess we were more interested in that than normal. All right, well, this was good, and we will pick up in chapter 30 next week.
Since I won't be here next week, you might get through it.
Well, maybe.